The man everyone had stopped seeing, long before anyone cared about the machine. People noticed the sound. Every evening, just after the last shift whistle echoed across the valley, a slow metallic rhythm drifted from an abandoned municipal maintenance garage at the edge of town. It wasn't loud enough to disturb anyone, yet it carried through the quiet streets with an odd consistency. Steel gliding against steel, followed by a measured click, then silence. A few seconds later, the pattern began again. No one could quite identify what kind of machine made that sound. Some guessed it was an old lathe. Others joked that the building was haunted by forgotten factory equipment. Most stopped wondering altogether. The town had become accustomed to unfinished things. Empty storefronts, silent warehouses, rusting rail sidings, and people whose best years seemed permanently tied to industries that no longer existed. The garage fit naturally into that landscape. So did Elias Mercer. At 58, Elias had become almost invisible in the factory, where he'd worked for more than 3 decades. Officially, he was a maintenance machinist, a title that sounded respectable until someone younger described it as the guy who fixes what everyone else breaks. He rarely corrected them. His hands carried tiny scars that no longer healed completely. Fine lines of old burns crossed his wrists. Years of handling cold steel had thickened his fingers until even holding a paper coffee cup looked slightly awkward. Yet every morning, before sunrise painted the brick smokestacks with pale orange light, Elias unlocked the side entrance to the manufacturing plant with the same quiet precision he'd practiced for years. Inside, the air smelled of cutting oil, coolant, and hot metal. The building woke slowly. Compressed air hissed awake through overhead lines. Conveyor belts shuddered into motion. Forklifts beeped in distant aisles, while fluorescent lights flickered one row after another, until the vast production floor emerged from darkness. Most workers hurried toward their stations. Elias always paused, not for long, just enough to listen. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar orchestra settle into place. Bearings humming, gearboxes rotating, hydraulic pumps building pressure. Every machine had its own voice, and after 35 years he could hear when one note drifted slightly out of tune. That morning he changed direction before reaching his workstation. Machine 12, a large milling center near the north wall. Its operator, Tyler Dawson, looked surprised as Elias walked over. "I didn't call maintenance." "You were about to." Tyler frowned. "The spindle bearing." Elias rested 2 fingers lightly against the machine housing as it slowed between cycles. "It's beginning to chatter." Tyler shrugged. "Sounds fine to me." Before Tyler could answer, the next production cycle began. For several seconds, everything sounded perfectly normal. Then, a faint vibration, barely noticeable, almost hidden beneath the normal cutting noise. Tyler glanced at Elias. "You actually heard that?" Elias simply nodded. The younger operator gave an uncertain smile. "Lucky guess." Elias smiled back, though it carried no trace of offense. "Maybe." He walked away before anyone could continue the conversation. Behind him, Tyler stared thoughtfully at the machine. Across the production floor, people respected Elias in the practical way workers often respect experience. They knew he could solve problems others couldn't. They knew he rarely guessed. But respect had limits in a factory struggling to survive. Experience couldn't stop contracts from disappearing. Experience couldn't compete with cheaper overseas production. Experience couldn't convince corporate headquarters to modernize aging equipment. The company had already announced another review of operating costs. Rumors spread through break rooms faster than official memos. Another reduction, another restructuring, another list of names. Everyone pretended not to think about it. During lunch, conversations stayed safely away from layoffs. Instead, younger employees debated software upgrades and automated inspection systems they'd seen online. "Our next machines won't even need half the maintenance," one technician said confidently. "They'll practically fix themselves." Someone laughed. "Poor Elias will finally get a vacation." Several people chuckled politely. Elias happened to be sitting only 2 tables away. If he heard the remark, he gave no sign. He continued eating homemade vegetable soup from an old stainless steel thermos, carefully wiping the rim before sealing it again. When lunch ended, everyone returned to work. Elias stayed behind for another minute. He opened a notebook whose brown leather cover had faded from years of handling. Inside were pages filled with impossibly neat handwriting, measurements, tiny mechanical sketches, observations dated over decades. Most entries consisted of only a sentence or two. Machine 8 bearing noise increases with humidity. Misalignment repeats every 417 hours. Never trust a smooth vibration. It often hides the worst wear. He closed the notebook before anyone noticed. After work, while traffic flowed toward neighborhoods scattered across the valley, Elias drove in the opposite direction. His pickup truck was older than many employees at the factory. The paint had long since surrendered to weather. The passenger seat carried boxes of carefully organized metal components instead of groceries. 10 minutes later, he reached the abandoned municipal garage. The building had once serviced snowplows and road equipment before budget cuts left it empty. Now, cracked windows reflected the evening sky, while weeds pushed through broken asphalt outside. Elias unlocked 2 heavy steel doors. Inside, warm yellow workshop lamps slowly illuminated the darkness. Shelves lined every wall, not with expensive tools, with repaired ones. Old micrometers polished until they worked like new. Handmade measuring fixtures, boxes labeled in careful handwriting. Coffee cans filled with sorted bolts collected over decades. Everything had its place. At the center of the workshop stood something enormous beneath gray canvas tarps. The shape beneath them revealed almost nothing. Too broad for a milling machine, too narrow for a vehicle. No exposed electronics, no polished chrome, only hints of carefully machined steel beneath the edges of the fabric. Elias approached quietly. He rested one hand against the covered structure without pulling the tarp away. For several seconds he simply stood there, almost like greeting an old friend. Only then did he unlock a small cabinet fixed to the wall. Inside sat dozens of notebooks identical to the one he'd carried at work. Each spine carried a handwritten year: 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993. A lifetime measured not in calendars but in observations. He selected one at random, read a single page, then returned it to the shelf. Outside, evening rain began tapping softly against the metal roof. Inside, Elias rolled the canvas back just far enough to expose part of the machine. It wasn't beautiful. No glossy paint, no futuristic screens, just precisely machined steel, heavy flywheels, carefully balanced linkages, and surfaces worn smooth by thousands of careful adjustments. He turned a single brass lever. The workshop filled with that familiar rhythm, steel sliding, a measured click, silence, then another. The movement was almost impossibly smooth, not fast, not dramatic, but deliberate enough to suggest every motion had been refined countless times. Halfway through its cycle, Elias frowned. He stopped the machine immediately. He crouched beside one rotating assembly and listened, not to the mechanism itself, to something beneath it. His expression tightened ever so slightly. "There you are," he murmured. He made a tiny adjustment no larger than a quarter turn. The rhythm resumed. Perfect again. Outside, a utility worker driving past noticed light spilling through the cracked garage doors. Curious, he slowed just enough to glimpse the machine moving inside. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. Nothing about it looked revolutionary. In fact, it seemed oddly old-fashioned. Yet the precision of its movement unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He drove home still thinking about it. By the next morning, people were already asking the same question over coffee at the diner. What exactly is Elias building out there? No one had an answer. Not even Elias, what he never told anyone. The rumors reached the factory before Elias did. By 7 o'clock, the maintenance office was already buzzing with speculation. Someone claimed the old garage contained a secret government project. Another insisted Elias was restoring antique machinery for collectors. A forklift driver swore he'd seen enormous steel wheels disappear beneath a canvas tarp, while a delivery driver insisted there wasn't enough room inside the building to hold anything that large. Each version grew a little more dramatic. None came close to the truth. Elias listened without interrupting as he hung his weathered jacket on the same hook he had used for years. Finally, Tyler Dawson glanced toward him with a grin. "So, you gonna tell us what's hiding out there?" Elias poured himself a cup of black coffee. "Just an old machine." Tyler laughed. "Nobody spends 20 years building just an old machine." Elias looked down into his coffee. Maybe they're building something else. What? A better question. Before Tyler could press further, a loud metallic crack echoed across the production floor. Every head turned. Machine 12 had stopped in the middle of a production cycle. Operators hurried toward emergency stop buttons while supervisors reached for radios. Elias was already walking, not running. Walking. Years had taught him panic rarely reached a machine before he did. The spindle housing vibrated gently as alarms flashed above the enclosure. The young operators immediately began discussing electrical faults. Servo failure. No, controller issue. Maybe the encoder. They spoke over one another, eager to solve the problem before maintenance arrived. Elias crouched beside the machine without saying a word. He placed one hand lightly against the casting, closed his eyes, listened. 5 seconds, 10. Then he stood. It's the coupling. The maintenance supervisor frowned. It isn't even rotating. It doesn't have to. A toolbox was brought over. Several technicians watched with folded arms, while Elias removed an inspection cover no one else had considered opening. Inside sat a flexible coupling connecting the motor to the spindle assembly. One side had shifted less than 2 millimeters, tiny, almost invisible, enough to create a chain reaction through the drive system. The room grew quiet, not from shock, but from concentration, as everyone leaned closer. Elias loosened 3 bolts, made a careful adjustment using a brass feeler gauge worn smooth from decades of use. Retightened everything. Start it. The operator hesitated. You sure? No. Tyler looked surprised. No? I'm sure we'll learn something. The machine powered back on. Its spindle accelerated gradually. The vibration disappeared. Production resumed as though nothing had happened. Several younger technicians exchanged uncertain looks. One finally asked, "How did you know?" Elias wiped grease from his fingertips with an old cotton rag. "It told me." The technician frowned. "They don't talk." "They do." He smiled faintly. "You just have to stop talking first." The answer sounded almost poetic, yet there was nothing mystical about the way he worked. He simply paid attention in ways that most people no longer had time to. Late that afternoon, a notice appeared on the factory bulletin board. Regional Manufacturing Renewal Initiative. The announcement invited employees, engineers, mechanics, machinists, and independent inventors to present practical solutions that could improve efficiency in aging factories. The winning proposal would receive funding for field testing across several regional plants. Most workers barely glanced at it. The company had announced competitions before. They usually rewarded polished presentations more than practical ideas. Tyler noticed Elias reading the notice longer than anyone else. "You thinking about entering?" Elias folded the paper back against the board. "I already did." Tyler blinked. "You already what?" "Sent my application last week." "You never mentioned it." There wasn't much to mention. Tyler watched him walk away. For the first time since they'd met, curiosity replaced amusement. That evening the rain had cleared. The streets still glistened beneath fading sunlight, as Elias stopped at the small diner near the railroad crossing. The bell above the door chimed softly. Grace Holloway looked up from behind the counter. "There you are." She poured coffee before he even reached his usual booth. "You've been working too much." "I always work too much." She smiled. "That's different." Grace had known Elias longer than almost anyone still living in town. Years ago, their families had gathered for factory picnics beside the river. Back then, the mills operated around the clock. Children rode bicycles between rows of parked pickup trucks, while their parents talked about overtime instead of layoffs. Those memories felt borrowed now. Grace placed a slice of warm apple pie on the table. "I didn't order this." "I know." She sat across from him for the first time in months. "They've started talking." "So I've heard." "About your garage." Elias sighed quietly. "I was hoping they'd wait a little longer." Grace studied his face. "You've never cared what people thought before." "I still don't." "That's not true." He looked toward the rain-speckled window. "You only say that when you're worried." For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt familiar rather than uncomfortable. Finally, Grace reached beneath the counter and placed an old newspaper on the table. Its edges had yellowed with age. The headline read, "Rivergate Tool and Die to Close After 74 Years." Elias stared at it without touching the paper. "I thought you'd thrown these away." "I kept every one." He smiled sadly. "You always were terrible at throwing things away." "So were you." His eyes lingered on a grainy photograph beneath the headline. Hundreds of workers stood outside locked factory gates. Some looked angry. Most simply looked tired. Grace lowered her voice. "My husband never blamed management." Elias remained silent. He blamed himself. Elias finally answered, "So did I." Grace shook her head gently. "You couldn't have saved that factory." "I know, but I might have saved time." He tapped the newspaper lightly. "I saw the problem years before anyone listened." She waited. I just didn't know how to fix it. The words hung between them. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply honest. Grace understood then. The notebooks, the late nights, the hidden machine. They had never been about inventing something extraordinary. They had been about finishing a conversation that history had interrupted. Later that night, the garage glowed beneath rows of hanging workshop lights. The machine stood uncovered now, not because Elias expected visitors, because he had reached the point where hiding it no longer served a purpose. Its heavy flywheels rested motionless. Precision ground shafts reflected warm light. Every linkage had been polished not for appearance, but because friction had no place in its design. He opened one of his oldest notebooks. The first page was dated 31 years earlier. Across the top, written in careful pencil, were 6 words. Find the waste no one sees. Beneath the sentence stretched page after page of observations. Not inventions, questions, measurements, mistakes, failed calculations, ideas crossed out, entire mechanisms abandoned, margins filled with notes like, too complicated, depends on expensive materials, worker cannot repair this in the field, elegant, but unrealistic. He turned hundreds of pages. Every failure remained. Nothing had been erased, nothing hidden. His life's work wasn't a straight line toward success. It was a map of every wrong turn that eventually led somewhere useful. A faint knock echoed through the garage. Elias looked up. Standing hesitantly in the doorway was Tyler. I wasn't trying to spy, the young machinist said. I wanted to ask if the competition judges really are coming next week. Elias nodded once. They are. Tyler glanced toward the machine, unsure whether to step inside. For the first time, Elias didn't pull the canvas back over it. Instead, he said quietly, If you're curious. Tyler looked up. Come closer. As Tyler crossed the workshop floor, he expected to see some futuristic invention. He found something stranger. A machine that looked as though it belonged 50 years in the past. Simple, solid, almost ordinary. Yet every moving surface fit together with a level of precision he had never witnessed before. He couldn't explain why. He only knew he'd never seen anything built with such patience. And for the first time, he began to wonder whether the greatest breakthroughs sometimes arrive wearing the familiar face of yesterday. The smallest movement. By Monday morning, the story had outgrown the town. It began with a photograph. Someone had snapped a blurry image through the open garage doors just as the machine caught the afternoon light. The picture revealed almost nothing. Just heavy flywheels, thick steel linkages, and the back of an older man standing beside them with a wrench in one hand. Within hours, the image had been passed from phone to phone. Old machinist claims to have built something that could save factories. Some dismissed it as another internet exaggeration. Others called it wishful thinking from a town that had been waiting decades for good news. By lunchtime, however, the Regional Manufacturing Renewal Committee had made a decision. They wanted to see the machine in person. Not next month, not after more paperwork, on Wednesday morning. Elias received the phone call while replacing a worn hydraulic hose at the factory. The committee representative introduced herself politely, explained the evaluation process, and outlined what the judges would need for a demonstration. Elias listened without taking notes. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Mr. Mercer, do you have any questions? Only one. Go ahead. Will you be evaluating presentations? He paused. Or machines? The representative smiled softly on the other end of the line. The machine. Good. Nothing more needed to be said. Word spread through the factory almost immediately. Tyler found Elias tightening the last fitting on the hydraulic system. So it's true. Elias looked up. What is? The committee's coming. They are. Tyler folded his arms. You don't seem nervous. I am. You don't look nervous. Elias wiped his hands with an old shop towel. I've learned those aren't always the same thing. For the rest of the day, workers found excuses to pass through maintenance. Some asked practical questions. Others offered advice Elias hadn't requested. One even volunteered to help clean the garage. Elias thanked each of them, accepted none. The machine had always been his responsibility. It would remain that way until the demonstration. That evening, Tyler arrived anyway. He carried 2 cups of coffee and a cardboard box. I know you said you didn't need help. I did. I brought sandwiches. Elias looked at the box. That's not really helping with the machine. No, Tyler smiled. But people build better things when they've eaten. For the first time in years, Elias laughed. It wasn't loud, just genuine. They ate sitting on overturned wooden crates while evening sunlight stretched across the workshop floor. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The silence was comfortable. Eventually, Tyler looked toward the machine. "I'd been thinking about something." Elias waited. "You could have patented this years ago. Maybe. You could have sold it. So why didn't you?" Elias stared at the flywheel turning slowly under its own weight. "When I was 27, I thought every problem needed a clever answer." He reached over and gently stopped the wheel with 2 fingers. "When I turned 40, he looked toward the shelves filled with notebooks. I realized most problems need an understandable answer." Tyler frowned. "I don't follow." "If a mechanic in a small factory can't repair what I build," he shrugged, "then I haven't solved much." Tyler let the thought settle. It was a philosophy completely opposite to the direction modern manufacturing seemed to be heading. Complexity had become a symbol of progress. Elias had spent decades removing it. The next 2 days disappeared beneath careful preparation. Not polishing, not repainting. Testing, again and again. The machine ran through identical cycles while Elias recorded temperatures, tolerances, vibration readings, and wear patterns in another notebook whose pages were already nearly full. Every successful run was followed by another inspection. Every inspection ended with another tiny adjustment. Tyler eventually asked the obvious question. "If it already works, why do you keep changing it?" Elias tightened a bearing cap. "I'm not changing it." "What are you doing?" "Listening." "To what?" "The things it'll be doing 5 years from now." Tyler smiled. "I still don't understand how your mind works." Elias returned the smile. "Neither do I some days." Wednesday arrived beneath low gray clouds. The committee's vehicles rolled into the yard shortly after 9. There were only 5 people. No television cameras, no cheering crowd. Just engineers, manufacturing specialists, and an economist responsible for evaluating long-term feasibility. Exactly the audience Elias had hoped for. The committee chair introduced herself simply. "We appreciate you inviting us." "I appreciate you coming." There were no speeches, no dramatic unveiling. Elias pulled the canvas from the machine with the same care he might have used uncovering an ordinary workbench. The visitors walked around it slowly. One engineer crouched to examine the bearings. Another studied the linkage geometry. A third looked puzzled. "I was expecting electronics." "There are a few," Elias answered. "They're inside?" "No." He pointed toward a modest control cabinet mounted on the wall. "They're there." The engineer looked back at the machine. "So the intelligence isn't in the machine?" Elias shook his head gently. "The intelligence shouldn't have to rescue bad mechanics." The committee members exchanged thoughtful glances. Already, this wasn't the presentation they had expected. A worn industrial milling machine sat nearby. It had been borrowed from a neighboring factory scheduled to retire it the following month. Its spindle accuracy had deteriorated beyond production standards. Replacement would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Repair wasn't considered economically worthwhile. Elias connected his machine. No fanfare, no countdown. He simply checked the alignment one last time and rested his hand on the brass operating lever. The workshop became quiet, not because anyone expected a miracle, but because every experienced machinist instinctively respected the moment before a machine came to life. Elias pulled the lever. The flywheel began to turn. Steel linkages moved with calm, deliberate precision. The familiar rhythm filled the garage. Slide, click, pause, slide, click. For several minutes, nothing extraordinary happened. Then the borrowed milling machine started its own cycle. The harsh vibration that had defined it for years began to fade. Not instantly, gradually. Each rotation became smoother than the last. One committee engineer instinctively placed 2 fingers against the machine housing. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Another checked a dial indicator mounted to the spindle. The needle barely moved. She checked it again, then once more. No one rushed to conclusions. Engineers trusted measurements more than excitement. When the final test piece emerged, it was passed quietly from hand to hand. Each inspector measured it independently. The numbers matched, again and again. The old machine, written off as obsolete, was producing parts with intolerances no one believed it could still achieve. The economist looked around the room before speaking. "If these results hold under long-term testing..." He paused, almost choosing his words carefully. We may not need to replace nearly as many machines as projected." Elias said nothing. He only looked at the weathered milling machine humming steadily beside his own. For a brief moment, it seemed less like a worn-out piece of equipment and more like an old craftsman who had simply been given the chance to breathe again. Outside, rain began falling softly against the garage roof. Inside, no one applauded. There was no dramatic celebration. Only quiet professionals standing around a machine that had answered a question many believed no longer had an answer. And for the first time in decades, Elias allowed himself to believe that perhaps the work he had carried alone for so many years no longer belonged only to him. What remained after the applause never came. 3 weeks later, the garage was quieter than it had been in years. Not because the machine had stopped, because people had finally stopped treating it like a mystery. The committee had completed its first round of testing at 2 aging factories, nearly 100 miles apart. Engineers measured spindle wear, energy consumption, alignment drift, maintenance intervals, and production accuracy. Every figure was compared against months of historical records. The numbers didn't promise miracles. They promised something far more valuable: time. Machines scheduled for retirement were continuing to meet production standards. Maintenance costs were falling. Unexpected shutdowns had become less frequent. For plant managers balancing impossible budgets, that was enough to keep difficult conversations with corporate headquarters from turning into closure notices. Elias read the reports only once. Then he filed them inside a cabinet without celebration. He had spent too many years chasing a solution to become distracted by headlines. The real work in his mind had only begun. Tyler found him replacing a worn bronze bushing on a test fixture. "I figured you'd be celebrating." Elias looked up. "I am." Tyler glanced around the workshop. There were no balloons, no visitors, no reporters, just the familiar smell of machine oil and fresh-cut steel. "This doesn't look much like celebrating." Elias tightened the last bolt before answering. "When a machine runs properly," he said, "the best sound it makes is nothing unusual." Tyler smiled. "I think that's the most confusing thing you've ever said. It'll make sense one day." The phone rang constantly. Manufacturers wanted demonstrations, universities requested interviews, trade magazines asked for photographs and technical articles. One company offered to purchase the design outright. The amount attached to the proposal would have allowed Elias to retire comfortably. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside its envelope, and mailed it back with a handwritten note. "Thank you for your generous offer." The design was never intended to belong to one company. Grace shook her head when he told her. "You turned down that much money?" "I turned down that agreement." "There's a difference?" "A very large one." He stirred his coffee slowly. "If one company owns it," he said, "the towns that need it most may never afford it." Grace studied him for a long moment. "You've thought about this for years." "I've had years to think." One rainy afternoon, the committee returned. This time they weren't carrying clipboards. They brought folders. Inside were contracts establishing a cooperative manufacturing program. Rather than licensing the machine to a single corporation, regional factories would jointly fund production, while local vocational schools received training materials free of charge. The committee chair placed the documents on the workbench. "We changed the proposal." Elias looked up. "You did. We realized your invention isn't just a product." She smiled gently. "It's infrastructure." For the first time since they'd met, Elias appeared genuinely surprised. "You listened." "We did." Training sessions began the following month. Young apprentices expected to meet a brilliant inventor. Instead, they found a patient machinist who insisted they sweep the floor before touching any equipment. One student whispered to another, "I thought we'd be building the machine today." Elias overheard him. "We are." The student looked around, confused. "I don't see any parts." Elias handed him a broom. "The floor is the first part." Some of the apprentices exchanged puzzled glances. Others quietly started sweeping. By lunchtime, they understood. A misplaced metal chip could change a measurement. A dirty workbench could damage a precision surface. Carelessness rarely announced itself immediately. It accumulated, just like excellence. Tyler became the unofficial assistant instructor. Only months earlier, he had believed experience belonged in museums. Now he found himself repeating Elias's habits without noticing. He paused to listen before diagnosing machines. He labeled every drawer. He sharpened tools instead of replacing them. One evening he caught himself correcting a younger mechanic. "Don't look at the vibration meter first." The mechanic frowned. "What should I look at?" Tyler smiled. "The machine." As soon as the words left his mouth, he laughed. "I sound exactly like him." Across the workshop, Elias heard the exchange. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. Autumn arrived with crisp mornings and golden light filtering through the garage windows. The shelves had changed, not because the notebooks were gone, because new ones had appeared. Different handwriting, different names. Young machinists had begun recording their own observations, mistakes, measurements, ideas that failed, questions without answers. Elias ran a hand across the newest notebook and opened to the first page. Instead of formulas, the apprentice had written a single sentence. "If I understand why it works today, I'll know why it fails tomorrow." Elias closed the cover carefully. "That's a good place to start," he murmured. Months later, the old factory where Elias still worked announced something few employees had expected. Layoffs were canceled. Not forever, not because every problem had disappeared, but because extending the life of existing equipment had freed enough resources to keep several production lines operating while new contracts were negotiated. The announcement wasn't dramatic. It arrived in an ordinary email, followed by a brief meeting. Workers read it quietly, some nodded. In manufacturing, relief often looked remarkably similar to routine. As the afternoon shift began, Machine 12 completed another cycle. Its spindle turned with the same smooth confidence Elias had predicted months before. Tyler stood beside it, listening. He caught a faint, unfamiliar note beneath the steady hum. Anyone else would have ignored it. He called for maintenance. Then he stopped himself. He fetched his own tools instead. Removing the inspection cover, he smiled as he found the coupling had drifted just enough to require adjustment. Barely 2 millimeters. He couldn't help laughing. Elias, working several aisles away, looked over. "Everything all right?" Tyler tightened the final bolt and restarted the machine. It settled into its familiar rhythm. Without raising his voice, he answered, "It told me." Elias nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. The lesson had finally found its next keeper. A freight train rolled slowly past the factory, under the fading evening sun. For the first time in years, every loading dock was open. Workers moved steadily between machines that many had once believed were nearing the end of their usefulness. The greatest change wasn't hidden inside Elias's invention. It lived in the people who had learned to see value where others had only seen age. And as the factory lights glowed against the coming dusk, the quiet inventor locked his toolbox, switched off the workshop lamp, and walked home, knowing that the future of his life's work no longer depended on his own two hands.